call me no thumbs road.
Really? Yeah, we watched the playoff game years ago.
Okay.
in Dallas.
We're good?
You're good.
We're good.
We watched
Okay,
the Super Bowl.
good morning, everybody. It's a lovely Tuesday morning and welcome to council workshop for May 14th. The time is 11 a.m. I will call the meeting to order at that forum. We'd like to start the meeting off in a good way by acknowledging that the city of Maple Ridge carried out its business under traditional and unceded territory of the Métis First Nation and the Kwantlen First Nation. Madam Clerk, did you have anything you wanted to jump in on?
No.
Nope, okay, we're good. Next, we're gonna move on to the approval of the agenda. Can I get a motion to move the item? Moved by Councilor Youssef, seconded by Councilor Guerrero. Any additions to the agenda? Being none, call the question. All those in favor, motion carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next item, adoption of the minutes from April 23rd, 2024. Can I get a motion to move this item? Moved by Councilor Guerrero, seconded by Councilor Schiller. Any errors, omissions? Seeing none, we'll call the question. All those in favor? Motion is carried unanimously. Next item, we will go to item 5.1. We have a presentation.
We do.
Madam Clerk.
I'll start it over to.
All right, good morning. So today we are continuing our conversation on small scale multi-unit housing and specifically looking at what the province put forward in terms of the policy considerations and what that looks like in our context and what we'll be bringing forward as zone amending bylaws. So I'll walk through a bit of the background and kind of characterize what the small scale multi-unit housing is. But before we get into those details, I just wanted to say kind of where this work came from or the background behind it is we're very cognizant of the province's intent to bring more housing faster, make it easier for people to have housing and address the housing crisis. At the same time, we've heard comments from the community and council about how we can enable these housing forms while respecting the character of our neighborhood and what we've seen to date. So it's all about balance. In a couple of areas, we were able to kind of push the envelope, and then there's a couple of areas which I'll identify where we might be taking a little bit more of a conservative approach in the short term. This is sort of what we were kind of coming with, and the material that you will see is really a collaborative effort between our engineering team, our building team, and our planning team, because ultimately everything comes together to bring the housing forward. So as you're aware, at the end of last year, new pieces of housing legislation came into effect. The focus on today is specifically on the one that enables up to 4 or 6 units on single detached and duplex zone lots. Shortly after the legislation came forward, the province also provided the provincial policy manual and site standards document. I will generally refer to it as a policy manual, and it really writes out or sets out the province's aspirational outcomes for zoning and site standards and what they'd like to see and what they'd like local governments to enable. So when we are doing our zoning bylaws, that is the piece that we are to consider for the bylaw that will be coming before you in June following this conversation. So we've been talking about this now for a couple of months, but small scale multi-unit housing is really this amorphous term that refers to a range of housing units, styles, and configurations. So at this point in time, we are proposing that secondary suites, detached garden suites will fall under this heading. Duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, the province often calls them houseplexes. We don't generally use that term. I will stick to saying fourplexes, as well as mini townhomes. So if it's 3 or 4 units pushed together, maybe it's constructed in a townhouse style, but it is one of the forms that could be enabled under this catch-all of a term. And one of the elements to keep in mind is the housing form and the number of units are slightly read separately. So if you're on a lot that's allowed 3 units, perhaps it's a duplex and a detached garden suite, or it's a triplex, right? So this is where the province is coming at it from a form of flexibility. And at this point in time, we are open to enabling that flexibility subject to building code, which we'll get to in a moment. So this is just that chart that we've seen a couple of times now where the province has set out, depending on the size of lot you have, this impacts the number of units you may have. So on our smaller lots, under 280 square meters, the province is dictating 3 units. In many cases, this is really your single family with a secondary suite and a detached garden suite. So it's still going to maintain that character of a single family neighborhood. And then when we start looking at the 281 up to 4,050, this is where we get the most flexibility. So this could also be 3 units if someone is interested in maintaining that, 4 units up to 6 units if we're within a particular distance of a prescribed bus stop. And then for the lots that are over 4,050, we're not necessarily touching on as much today because it is anticipated that those would subdivide into a smaller lot form before enabling the higher housing or density count. So what this looks like, I know we've had this, a version of this map presented a couple of times. I will say this is not yet the final one either. We received more information yesterday from the TransLink as well. So this is a snapshot in time. So this map very much represents approximately 14,000 lots within our urban containment boundary that could enable up to 4 units per lot. Approximately 2,000 would enable the 6 units, and this is that zoomed in look of what that prescribed bus stop could look like. We have a new map coming forward, so this is no longer the most accurate map, but for today's purposes, it gives you an idea of where these stations are located. And then we have roughly a couple hundred that are under the 280 square meters that could enable up to the 3. Not necessarily shown at the scale that we're working with, you can't exactly see them very well. So as mentioned earlier, when we are bringing forward this zone amending bylaw, these are the housing forms that we're starting with. So on the left-hand side, this is the breakdown of the types of housing forms, the current range of diversity in zones that we have in effect today. So we already allow duplex, triplex, and fourplex through the rezoning process, as well as the courtyard development, which was able to permit up to 8. And then of course, the mini townhouse version of these forms. So at this point in time, we're not proposing to remove the larger courtyard developments from the zoning bylaw. Them and townhouse developments would still be enabled through the rezoning process. So this is where you may need to pick up a couple of extra lots to do a larger townhouse development, or if you are looking under the rezoning process, you could have 8 on this particular, like just subject to the regular zoning process. But the one on the left-hand side really reflects what the province was hoping to bring forward. The next big question has always been, if we do go through a subdivision process, what is the new minimum lot size? So historically, we've been trying to enable smaller lots because that was bringing forward a range of housing types. However, at this point in time, there are some concerns about being able to fit 3 or 4 units on our smaller residential lots. So we are proposing that the new minimum lot size would be increased to 450 square meters. So this is in line with our existing R4 zone. So it's a zone we have started to see come into neighborhoods. It's a little bit wider, it'll give us a little bit of space to fit 3 units for sure, depending on the type of housing that they would like. 4 can fit. It's just going to need to take a closer look at how it fits from the building code perspective. And this is one of those elements where everybody's learning together. So this is a starting point. We'll bring forward the zone amending bylaw. We'll see how it works, and then further amendments may be required later this year as we see where maybe some pain points are or where we can release a little bit more. So this proposed new minimum lot area does align with our existing OCP policies that we have. It maintains that flexibility that's largely enabled under our urban residential and major corridor land use designations. I will say some municipalities have picked a larger minimum lot area. It is certainly on the table. Our next largest lot size would be 557 square meters. So we do have some room to increase, but we are also trying to balance the community's desire for attainable single family home ownership. So this is one of the starting points that we are proposing for this piece of work. And then what this looks like from a zoning or setback requirement. So this is a breakdown of lot size for front, rear, and side setbacks. So you'll notice in the policy manual that they use a slightly different cutoff or threshold for their categories. So we are proposing that the threshold be closer to 800 square meters versus the 1,215 that they've identified. And this is largely to maintain that alignment with some of our existing zones. So today, if you wanted to rezone to a triplex, we'd be looking at that 800 meters squared as the minimum lot area to kind of enable that, and then fourplexes in certain cases. So we think we know we've done the testing that you can fit 3 units or 4 units on a lot that size. And we're comfortable with the level of setbacks that we have in our zoning bylaws. So we've kind of pulled those out of our tested zones and are proposing them for this new small scale multi-unit housing zone. We are proposing a slightly larger front setback than what the province is looking for. We certainly appreciate where the province is coming from, but the front lot line setback does help enable permeability, which we'll get to in a second, as well as parking. So it also aligns with kind of the setback that we've been seeing in our existing neighborhood. So it will help maintain that consistency. We can still have the flexibility of what the buildings look like and how many units, but at least the streetscape will kind of have that streamline. It won't look awkward is what we're hoping for. And then our side setbacks are largely dictated by the BC building code. So we are more than happy to revisit them if anything changes, but they're very much reflective of life safety and code requirements. The province is also very interested in how high these buildings can be, as well as how much of the lot that they cover. So we are proposing to align with the number of stories that they are open to, so namely 3, but we will be calculating height a little bit differently than how the province would like us to. And again, that is to maintain that consistency with the urban form that we have today, and that is in stream. This is an element that we can certainly revisit in 5 years or 7 years as the character of the neighborhood start to change. But for 2024, this would help maintain that consistent neighborhood feel. And the lot coverages and permeable landscaping requirements are very much in line with what we have today. The third category, the one that's a little bit off from what the province is looking for, but we're close to what they're hoping for. And then the last fun one is parking. So we are aware that for those purple lots within 400 meters of a prescribed bus stop, we are unable to require parking. So that is outside of the local government's control at this point in time. It is still obviously a voluntary amenity that developers will be able to provide should they wish to. For lots outside of the 400 meters, we are able to enable parking requirements. Today, all of these forms of housing that we are currently discussing would require 2 for your duplex, triplex, fourplex, and then our secondary suites and our detached garden suites, we generally look at 1 space to be provided for those uses. So this is one of those elements where we are taking a more conservative approach than what the province would like. So at this point in time, we're proposing dropping the 2 space to 1.5, with the caveat that we are open to revisiting this once BRT is constructed and or local service areas for transit is improved. But that's really the big thing. If there's going to be a parking reduction, we need to have other options of transportation available. And we know in some of these neighborhoods it is coming soon, but it isn't necessarily in effect today. So it's that phased approach, if you will, about what we are able to do in July of 2024 to meet the province's intent, while also balancing our needs as a community and having the amenities necessary. So the last bullet really speaks to that. When we see applications come in areas that we know have very poor transit or have a little bit more space on the lot based on whatever they're hoping to do or their designs, that we will try and encourage the standard, or today's standard, soon to be the historic standard, of 2 parking stalls per unit. And that would just be to help mitigate some of those pinch points that we may see in the short term. So those are the requirements that the province is looking for our consideration of. This is the report that kind of details you know, you get a snapshot of what the province is looking for, what we have, and then what we're proposing. When the bylaw comes back before you, it's going to be a little bit more cut and dried, and it's just going to be a classic zone amending bylaw. But there's a couple other considerations that I just like us to discuss today, not necessarily that will form part of a zone amending bylaw. So one of them is the continued use of development permits. So we have one in effect that applies for our triplex and fourplex uses today. We are proposing to maintain it for fourplexes, and this is just really going to help. The intent of the development permit is to encourage builders and designers to look at the neighborhood context and bring in elements that will reflect and complement the neighborhood, as well as kind of massage the massing, so we don't end up with something too bulky next to something too small. So it's again about balance and finding how we can kind of fit these different housing forms together. So we are proposing to maintain this for fourplexes, but it will become voluntary for triplex. It's not currently required for duplex, but it would be the same component, right? It just helps speak to some of the articulation and massing of what these forms could look like. And then similarly on the variance permits, we appreciate the province's intent about bringing housing in faster. So of course, if some of the setbacks are a little bit sticky, this is a conversation that we can have, and there's multiple options for variance permits that can be explored. It's just really just identifying that it's an option that will remain available for these housing forms. The private outdoor space, so this would be a requirement so that each unit has access to ground-oriented private space. The province is silent on this one. A number of municipalities are bringing forward a requirement for this, and we do have this in effect today for townhouses and triplexes. So we are proposing that a minimum outdoor space be available for these units. Some municipalities have had a conversation about stratification, either restricting. We're not there. We're happy to have the unit stratified, subject to the Strata Property Act. So secondary suites and detached garden suites would not be able to be stratified, but a triplex or fourplex could be, if that was of interest. And then again, aligning with the intent of the province, it is anticipated that the street frontage upgrades for the small scale multi-unit housing would be considered similar to how we currently review single detached housing. Amendments are required to bring this into effect, but essentially we wouldn't be requiring the same level of upgrades as we would through a rezoning for a townhouse. So it's intended to make the burden of housing a little bit lighter. And two more considerations. So one of the unique elements of our zoning bylaw is we have something called a temporary residential unit. We've had it in effect since 1999, and it was really a precursor to what is now considered a secondary suite. So now that we are going to be mandating secondary suites in all residential zones, it's kind of time to say goodbye to this use. So one of the recommendations in the report is a little bit separate from the small scale multi-unit housing, and it is to direct staff to remove this use. What this means is that anyone wishing to bring in a secondary suite like unit will just be evaluated against the secondary suite requirements under the BC building code. So the use will be very, very similar, but the requirements are a little bit different. And this is really for clarity, life safety, and making everyone's life a little bit. And then the last point on this slide is just acknowledgement that we are aware Bill 16 received royal assent in April. So this is the piece of legislation that enables us to take road dedication at building permit. We're still looking into exactly what this looks like on an operational level, but I know there had been some concerns about being able to provide the necessary sidewalk amenities and road space for these types of housing. And it's safe to say that we know we can. Just the exact details, we're working through what that process will look like. And very lastly, we know we have files that are in stream. So we have a couple of options on, a couple of categories on the screen. So for the first one, anything that's in stream on a development application, whether it be building permit or development, we are very much open to legacying these items. So if they're in stream, they can continue under the zoning and requirements that we have today. There isn't necessarily, we're not going to make them change. If they would like to provide secondary suites in a unit that doesn't currently require secondary units, that's up to them. And recognizing that these amendments are not yet in effect, it is anticipated that they will have up until June 30th to get in queue. And then they will be legacy, but anything new, so mainly new subdivisions for July or August, that's when we're going to start be looking at the new minimum lot size. On the flip side, for those that are very interested in what this could look like for their properties, we're able to provide high-level guidance between now and June, but we're not encouraging pre-application meetings or applications to come in into July. That just gives us that little bit of wiggle room to have the zone amending bylaws in effect, make the changes necessary to our handouts and checklists, and be ready to welcome those applications in July. And then, as is typical, our process is to take a look at our zone amending edits a year into the process. So it is anticipated that we will do a review in a year. Of course, if we notice pain points or anything beforehand, we will bring that back in advance. And it also gives us a good opportunity with the fact that our zoning bylaw is going to be more comprehensively reviewed to make some of those changes through that process as well. A little time chart that we've seen before, but very much just to say these changes will come back before you in June. They will be in effect by the end of June, and that we have a couple of other items of work to do after that, mainly the housing needs report, which is very much on track to meet that January 1st deadline, as well as the first review of the OCP to bring in those housing needs elements. So I think we're in good stead in terms of timelines on those other items, but happy to take questions or comments on that as well. And then just as a reminder, these are the recommendations in the report before you for a conversation. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for what must have been a very tough report to put together. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions because it's going to take some time to absorb all of this. Where do we stand with the new regulations? How will it affect us in the future? Are there any unintended consequences and that sort of stuff? We do have recommendations on the board as we are in workshop. So I will open up for questions from council. Councilor Youssef.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation report. Just a few quick questions. One predominantly to do with the increase in number of units. How does our current infrastructure look to be able to handle that density? As you mentioned, some neighborhoods in some areas will be able to go to 4 units, others will be able to go to 6 units. I'm thinking predominantly on the storm sewer, sanitary sewer, and water side. Roads aside, we're already above the congestion mark where most of our residents would be happy to, but to look at the infrastructure, are we able to handle right now that much pressure? And then the second follow-up question to that is the province, now that they're giving us this ability, I'm not going to say forcing it down our throats, are they helping us to upgrade our infrastructure in any way, shape, or form to be able to accommodate that density?
So in terms of the capacity, we have been conducting a number of studies to determine what the impact is going to be. So in some cases, we are comfortable with the level of infrastructure that we have available, either in effect today or recognizing that some site-specific solutions may be required. Drainage is an excellent example of that, where the infrastructure itself may not entirely be at size, but we know that there's site-specific options that we can do to mitigate that. There are other elements that we will be pursuing an extension on, so this will grant us a little bit of time and wiggle room in order to take a closer look at what our infrastructure can handle. So that's the deadline that you saw that was for June 1st. We are framing our extension conversation very much under, we need a little bit more time to take a closer look. We have a couple of areas of concerns. We just want a little bit more time to know for sure where it is, and where possible, we are drilling down to a lot basis. So we will have maps available that kind of show where we know we're good for infrastructure of whatever particular type, and then where we just might need an additional QEP to provide comment, or what the infrastructure piece is will just depend on where we are in the community. So the extensions are largely limited to infrastructure, so that's very much going to be focused on, in our case, it'll be water. So what that looks like in terms of from a fire flow pressure perspective. We are able to look at exemptions as well, but those are more on the geotechnical hazardous side, and we will be exploring that option.
Thank you for that. And through you, Mr. Chair, more of an engineering question. When it comes to our storm sewer, correct me if I'm wrong, do we have an issue with the divide between the 7-inch standard and now current 8-inch standard, or are we okay for the most part within the areas that we would be considering redevelopment?
We did take a look at our drainage system. We have a consultant looking to, we will look at on-site retention, which is just to extend what we currently do, to allow that to proceed with some of our, because our infrastructure is not in place there. So that'll be on-site. We're working on that for utilities group.
Thank you very much for that. And if there's any assistance that would be required on the Metro Vancouver side, I'm happy to take that on. Second point, Mr. Chair, through you, is the height. When we're landing at 9.5 meters, yet we are, of course, looking at a greater density, multi-generational families that are more and more becoming prevalent in our community. Is the 9.5 meters really allowing for that type of development now that we're going to see a significant amount of homes that are coming to end of life and being redeveloped either way? Are we falling short, or are we able to, as you mentioned, we're not going with the provincial guidelines on height? Would we be better served possibly to go with those provincial guidelines in order to increase the height and not, for lack of a better word, forgive the pun, fall short on this matter?
It's certainly an option. One of the precedents that we use is actually the RT2 zone. So it has a slightly lower height today. And that was in recognition of the fact that these housing forms at the time were going into very low height neighborhoods. As those neighborhoods started to turn, it was anticipated that the height would be released. Right, so the first couple were going to be a little bit shorter, but we knew that the future was going to become 9.5 in those cases. So we're sort of using at this point in time the same lens. We recognize today 9.5 will align largely with what we're seeing, and then we may be able to release it in the future. From a urban design perspective, there were some concerns with releasing it straight to 11 today and what that may do to the neighborhoods. It's certainly an option, and we're happy to take a closer look at it. But as a starting point, we certainly felt more comfortable with the 9.5.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I, as one, would be much more in favor of going to 11 meters again, because we're going to see some of the homes coming to end of life and moving in that direction as an entire neighborhood. So rather than stifling our growth, let's allow for more growth within existing neighborhoods. I am very comfortable with the parking approach that you're taking. I do firmly believe that no builder will build a product that is not attractive, so they will provide the necessary parking as per market requirements overall. And lastly, through you, Mr. Chair, on our DP process that you mentioned would still be in place, or that staff would like to continue having it. How long is your average development permit to go through our process?
I can't speak, Mark or Marlene may be able to speak to how long it's taking today. The caveat I would just offer is this would be a very specific DP process to this housing form. For the first 6 months to a year, these applications will follow a different process and is intended to streamline and be efficient. We know there's, again, those little pieces that we're going to have to learn and figure out together. So it will have its own workflow.
And do we have any idea on the timeline for this different process that would be specific to this one? Just ballpark figure, I'm not going to hold you to it.
We don't have it.
Okay.
It's anticipated to be quicker than what we're doing.
Fair.
That's all I can say.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my
Thank you.
questions.
Councillor Dwight.
Thank you. Speaking to the height again, I like the cautious approach at first. I mean, you mentioned that after a year we could revisit. They would always have the opportunity to come and ask for an increase in height, correct?
That is correct.
So I would rather keep it the way it is, because if I think back to why we reduced it to 9.5 was because of the concerns of neighborhoods where these very tall buildings going in form the character it came down to. So, and that's not to say if an entire block decided to rebuild, that's a different story, because now you're not impacting a rancher that's beside it all those. So I think the cautious approach is good at first. We're gonna have a lot of little tweaks as we go along and figure out, you know, this isn't working or it is working. So I would rather err on the side of caution than going too far, because I can think of a couple of buildings in our community that just do not fit in. They look terrible. The design is terrible. And that's what prompted this many years ago when we had that discussion. The parking, I agree, the parking, the market will determine. I mean, if a builder decides that they're not gonna provide parking, they won't be able, some cases, they won't be able to sell their buildings. So they'll be forced to provide some kind of parking, whether we tell them to or not. Because the reality is, even if you're near a bus station, the families will probably have one vehicle, not all, some. So that the market will determine that, and if not, if they decide not to, it's something we may have to look at in the future as to the existing neighborhood around. If parking becomes an issue for the existing neighborhood, we might have to look at that. What does that look like? Because if that building didn't provide any parking and now the existing neighborhood is bearing that, there's ways that we can look at that, you know. That's down the, I guess we'll see that on a case by case. Temporary residential use. So there currently is covenants on these particular uses, because it was designed to be for families and we weren't allowed to have non-family residents living in that. So how does that, is it up to those individual households that have TRUs to remove that, or will the city remove that?
I don't believe we would. We have a few elements of this to attend to. I don't know if releasing all those covenants would be a starting point. And I would say in order to release the covenant, they'd probably have to come in and become a secondary suite. So if anyone has a TRU and that is a process that they are open to, that we can certainly facilitate. But I don't think at this point in time in 2024, we would be calling up anyone with a TRU and letting them know that they could come to the city to discharge the covenant. It's something that we can make a note of and look at for in the future though.
Okay, awesome. And the last councillor you mentioned about the infrastructure, and again, we're just gonna have to still be advocates to the province and saying, you know, whether it's roads, sewer, water, hospitals, schools and hospital really, you know, concerns me too. Because we already don't have enough space, so so we'll just have to be that strong voice to advocate for what we need in our community. Thank you, and thank you very much for all the hard work that's gone into this. I know you didn't do it all by yourself, but I know you're the spokesperson for the group. But thank you for, it was a lot of work and will continue to be a lot of work, so appreciate that.
Thank you. I'm not seeing Councilor Carreras, followed by Councilor Schaefer.
Thanks. I love these bills. I've shared my thoughts many times with my MLAs as well. I do love the review portion. Thank you. I think you've heard me talk about how much I love check back in on policy and procedures and how important that is, because whatever you do, there is always going to be unintended consequences. And so I really appreciate the check back in. That's important to me. The height piece, because that seems to be a bit of a discussion. So the province has 11 and we're hoping to do 9.5.
Yes, but we measure height, I think, a little bit differently than how they're measuring it.
So we measure height to the midpoint of the peak roof, so we're 4 and 12 pitch. Also, just to note that in our townhouse zone right now, which is our one zone, we have 9.5 meter maximum height, so this is in line with actually our townhouse zone. And most of our single family zones, some of the single family zones are 8 meters, so we see it allows quite a bit of flexibility with peak roof, and that we use it for townhouses and most of our single family zones now.
Does 9.5 allow for, cause I look at the 3 levels in 2 different ways. I look at the 3 levels being this 1, 2, 3, like a threeplex on a lot. And the 9.5, would that allow for 3 levels above ground? Okay, and that was the other question is, with basement suites, I would appreciate more basement suites that are above ground, just for people's happiness and light and well-being. And if the 9.5 allows for that. Okay,
9.5 will allow for 3 stories, and in fact, on some sloping lots, we've ended up with 3.5 to almost 4-story houses with 9.5 in a few cases, so.
okay. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm a little bit neutral in 9.5 versus 11. My key thing is it allows 3 full stories above ground. That's the piece that's the most important to me. And again, we have a year check-in, so I'm happy whatever you choose to do with that. I mean, the staged approach is probably not a terrible thing, because this is a community that's not Burnaby, it's not Vancouver, it's not New West, where a lot of these new legislative requirements make a lot of sense, and we have areas where it's a little bit different, right? Because we have very urban areas and we have sort of rural and suburban areas. I know the rural isn't touched very much by this, but the parking piece, I just have a question about the parking. How do we do 1.5 spaces per unit?
We round up to 2.
Oh, okay. So,
So the way we typically have parking, so if the formula works out that the number is 4.5 spaces per lot, we would look at 5. Right, so we do not build past all.
yeah, I was just sort of curious how we would measure that. And then the third bullet is the one that's really important, because 400 meters isn't that far. And I get that, the 1.5, and as we go further away, obviously there's areas that are not serviced very well by transit at all. So what are we considering well serviced by transit?
The challenge there is our busiest routes really run east-west. So, and they tend to be captured under the prescribed bus stop radius. Beyond that, if there is a bus is a good starting point, but this is like, we're not dealing with a well service.
I mean, I look at, where I live, and it's still like a very residential area, it's not on the fringe, but the bus is really pretty non-existent, when it takes your kid 4 hours to get home from Tawasin via transit, with a 30-minute walk at 4 o'clock on a Friday.
Yeah.
There's some challenges there, and I mean, I look at, shift workers. Like, they don't have the ability to do transit in our community unless they're in the downtown core, and even then it's a bit skeptical at best, but yeah, I'm glad that's in there, because it does allow for a little flexibility, but we have no ability to push the developer, right? If they said, well, I'm not building it.
Within the 400, we don't, but outside of that, we have the authority to require parking. It's more, how does that relate to the province's conversation? And I think that's where we're taking that really incremental approach. We're only realistically dropping the parking requirement by 0.5. Depending on the type of housing that someone is building, they will likely provide more parking to, again, meet the consumer that they're hoping to sell to.
Well, the further away you get from the core, those are their family. So I have a question, because you referenced there's the height, there's the setbacks. There's a few, the parking pieces where the province has sort of had these suggestions. I don't know how strong those suggestions are, and we're doing things a bit differently. Does the province have to approve, like when we do 9.5 instead of 11, or our setbacks are a bit different? Does the province have the ability to overrule us on our decisions?
It's a good question. We have to notify the province when the zone amending bylaw has been put in place. I suspect they will have comments if they do see some areas where they would like us to go a little bit farther. They have certainly encouraged us, all local governments, to seriously consider the policy manual guidelines. So I think between this report and the next piece is really telling that narrative as to the incremental approach where we're happy to take a closer look in a year, right? So it isn't necessarily saying that we can't meet their policy requirements today, it's just what makes the most sense for our community. So it's going to be a bit of a balanced conversation for sure.
Yeah, and I guess it's the, and I think this is what local government has really said quite a bit through this process is one size doesn't fit all. And that's where the challenge is, what works for Vancouver is not gonna work in Maple Ridge, what works in New West isn't gonna work in Kelowna. And so I think that's the piece is trying to carve out how do we make it applicable for our community. The lot size, 450 square meters is how many, because I'm old school. I'm that old.
I don't work.
I can't dig in square meters.
Uh,
4,800, okay, so that's a decent size, and so that's when we're looking at all the brown areas, those are the ones that are sort of subdividable lots.
yes,
That if someone comes in and wants to subdivide it, the minimum lot size would go 4,800 square feet, so if they did put more lots, there was still a lot of space.
the one.
Cause they're all on the other, like they're all on the edges, right?
Yes, the one caveat is appendix C of the zoning bylaw still applies. So if it is a rural residential lot or a safe suburban residential lot, they would follow this, would be much larger than the 450 square meters. It's really those urban infill lots that this would become the new minimum lot size for.
Okay, thanks, where you're gonna see that infill, if they subdivide it, they're gonna put 4 units on it. And then this is just to the mayor on this piece, and I'm just gonna echo what my other colleagues have said around infrastructure and our role in advocacy. I know we haven't shied away from advocacy and we share it every single opportunity we have with our MLAs and ministers. But again, I think it's huge. The schools, there are no schools that have space and they're running out of space to even put more portables on there. Our hospital is undersized for our community as we grow even faster than anticipated. And, you know, it's not even just the roads and the sewers and the water, it's just those things like recreation facilities, right? They're a massive dollar amount. And if we're growing that quickly and that rapidly, we do need to have these other recreational pieces as well. And so I think we need to continue in a very, very strong way to advocate with the provincial government and the federal government, because the two of them are, you know, need more housing, and I'm happy to work with them to do more housing. I just want to make sure that we're getting the support that we need to do that as well. So thank you.
Just quickly speak to that. All the mayors in the lower mainland are seized with this, and we're all on the same page of how do we advocate for more infrastructure dollars? How do we advocate for the things that we need in our community? Because we're all struggling with the same way. So there's a few approaches that are being looked at as to how can we best advocate to the premier, to the MLAs and so on and so forth, but also to any party that's out there. I mean, obviously we have an upcoming provincial election, and we want to make sure that we're well positioned to work with any government that takes over. So it's important to make sure that we have an understanding with what that future might look like and what we as mayors and councils expect from our provincial government.
Yeah, I mean, they referenced the 1 billion that they gave to communities for infrastructure, but for our community, that was 6.5. 16.5, which gets you a block,
Yeah.
not even a block of a road, it gets you maybe a park, like it's. When they reference the 1 billion, it sounds great, but when you look at what it is per community, it doesn't get us very far.
No, and we're grateful for the 16.5.
Yeah.
It-
Just more.
There's no question about it. We need more, and a lot of this infrastructure, both from the province and the federal government, is directly linked to building more housing. You know, it was brought up earlier, do we have the right amount of water and sewage? At some point, we will have to switch those things over to bigger pipelines as we continue to grow. So as a municipality, we can't bear all of those costs on our own, right? So these are the challenges that we're faced with, but definitely hear what you're saying with all of that.
Thanks.
And I think it's a consistent theme with all the mayors as well. Councilor Schiller.
Thank you, Mayor Brittany, and I just also want to acknowledge the work of staff and also the way that you're managing to explain this to us, just step by step along the way. It's wonderful. Thank you. So I wanted to ask about secondary suites, so I believe that there are secondary suites in existence that aren't necessarily formally registered as secondary suites. And I believe some other municipalities are sort of offering a period of time where secondary suites can become registered. Are we doing anything in that area?
We are, so once the zone amending bylaw comes into effect, it essentially legalizes secondary suites in all single detached zones. We're just in the process of putting together what that program would look like, as well as the promotional elements to support it. So it'll probably take over the summer kind of to make sure we have the details in alignment, and then we'll be able to go out and kind of advertise that if you do have a secondary suite that may or may not be permitted, you know, we have a process in place, we'll be able to bring you in and start having that conversation to make them legal suites. So that work is anticipated to probably more of a 2025 implementation element, just because we're starting here. We know we need to get there, but we also want to make sure it's as efficient and streamlined as possible for those residents as well. It's definitely something that we're aware of.
So now that secondary suites are allowed, I mean, I imagine that there are still rules though that those secondary suites, like building code type things that may or may not be met, and so I'm just sort of curious as to how
So
that works.
we have our standard secondary suite code and setting requirements. And then it's our understanding that the BC Building Code is currently under review relative to small scale multi-unit housing in general. So there's likely to be some changes under that. And then it is also our understanding that there are some alternative review options available to building officials. So that's the kind of case by case conversation. And that's the program that just needs to be a little bit more fleshed out and developed, and we can bring back updates to council as you'd like. But in order to do that, we kind of needed this piece done first. So it's a little bit of that cart before the horse conversation. But we are very much aware that some of our houses have secondary suites that probably aren't going to fit the nice little build BC Building Code.
Thank you for that. Okay, yeah, the height, I think I'm neutral on it because I can see the arguments on both sides, so I'm happy to leave it up to staff from like what you think is best for the community now. And I think the height and the parking, you know, these are things that are evolving and they're going in a certain direction, and we will see how that unfolds. I mean, I'm happy to see a reduction in the parking requirements. I think that's the direction that we do need to go in. I'm curious around how we'll sort of measure what the impacts, like what can you actually measure that will sort of tell you whether this is being successful or not.
The easiest way to hear is when people come to City Hall and council. So the council comments that you receive, email, phones, conversations in the street are really one of the easiest ways to kind of get a temperature check on what's working and what's not. We have other metrics that we could certainly look at, infrastructure being constructed, complaint like by capita or neighborhood area. So there's a couple of things that we can look at. It's not a science. It is definitely a little bit of an art when you're bringing in a new change because it has to be implemented. So oftentimes the noise or the comments that you're getting is actually like back a phase of the requirement change. So we try to be sensitive to that as well. But to your point, we know where we need to go. It's just kind of what pieces of infrastructure or upgrades need to be in place in order to kind of let it out in a way that is going to have the most positive impact on our communities that we can manage. Like if there are going to be some growing pains, we're all fully aware of this, but yeah.
And along those lines, I noticed a couple times in the report, it would speak to like, say we would review this parking requirement, you know, when the BRT is completed. And while the BRT is such a significant project for the community, it makes me a little bit nervous to use that as the measuring stick because it really is kind of like the West Coast Express. It's gonna serve a certain customer, but it doesn't really speak to a a higher level of service throughout the community. So I do see in other parts in the report that it says like a more sustained level of service or something to that effect. And I mean, I think it's good for us to have specific milestones in there that would trigger it, but also just that we be aware that BRT is not going to solve our transit
It
challenges.
won't. I think there's also the evolving regional trends. So Metro Vancouver also does regular parking study, like on the parking front, they do their own regional parking studies. And when we get those recommendations and outcomes, we normally overlay them on our parking bylaw as well. So the BRT is identified largely because the prescribed bus stops very much fall within that corridor. We will have other mechanisms, and as more data becomes available, we will happily say, no, this is no longer serving us, or this is a conversation that needs to go before council. Would you like us to try something new? Would you like us to stick with what we have? So there's plenty of flexibility there.
Yeah, I think the minimum lot size, like the larger minimum lot size, that helps me sort of understand how we're managing some of the increased density. Are we aware of any work that the school district is doing around updating their own projections as a result of this legislation?
As a result of this legislation, we've had conversations with them throughout the first half of this year at a very high level in terms of our area planning processes. We've shared our projection data. We've shared our most recent BC statistics projection data that we've received. Those numbers only take this piece of legislation into effect to a certain amount because they're looking more at that 5 to 10 year time horizon, and this piece of legislation is very much intended to be that longer term housing diversity piece. But we have been data sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving to Councillor Tan.
Thanks, Mayor. Thank you for this presentation. I can see we're trying to implement in a way that's responsible for our community. A couple of questions. Is to go to the height piece, maybe if we can sort of speak, help me understand the difference between the 9.5 and the 11. So the extra 1.5 meters, what would that possibly allow for? If anything.
Which depends, as Amanda was saying. Height in the city is measured 9.5 meters to the midpoint of the roof.
Right.
And so if measured 11, it used to be measured 11 meters to the top of the roof. So in that case, it probably doesn't allow for anything extra. In fact, the 9.5 sometimes allows for a house, the steep roof that's 11.5 or something. So it's partly how it's measured.
Right.
If you just look at difference of 11.5 and 9.5, that's 1.5 meters or 5 feet, so half the story.
Right.
So we found that for the most part, the 9.5 meters works well with single family houses and in townhouses. Our townhouses are 9.5 meters as well.
That's good to know. I was wondering, and it's a good point about having some light in the basement suites. I wanted to understand if there was like that extra 1.5 meters could possibly add any extra, allow for an attic space or a loft space, for extra storage or extra, even like a little, little den bed, loft bed up there or anything like that.
Well, just depends on the lot. I mean, extra height could allow for more depending on the shape of the house and the grading on the lot.
Right.
But really, when we looked at 9.5, that was generally equivalent to 11.5 to the top of the roof before. So,
Okay.
and that's how it's being typically measured by the province and other municipalities.
Right, I see. Thank you for that. Okay. I think like my general thoughts around these, yes, we need to advocate more that infrastructure as we accommodate more folks, and also thinking about how do we not just Councilor Youssef says allow for the development to take place so that more folks are coming in. I'm just thinking about, I'm looking at all the different requirements it set, and I just want to make sure that that we're still allowing for that, the proliferation of new housing builds and not sort of putting too many restrictions on it that folks don't find it financially feasible to make that happen. And so one thing I was thinking about was the private outdoor space requirement. And could you remind me what the province's suggestion is on that and where we are right now?
They don't have a requirement. They're
Okay.
silent on it.
Right.
So yeah, I should say they're silent.
Right.
they may change their stance in the future.
Right,
It is something that a number of municipalities are bringing forward, and we have with some other zones
right.
that, so like our RT2 zone is the triplex zone. And that one came with the requirement for private outdoor space.
Right.
So at that point in time, it was generally understood that it would be equitable and fair for everyone within the building to be able to have some private space.
Right.
So we're carrying forward that
Right.
precedent and concept.
Right, I understand the preparing for it. I think from my perspective, I'm happy to not have that private outdoor space requirement, but instead have like a public shared space between the different units. I've seen a few successful models where as they talk about some more community oriented housing, sort of folks coming together and like sharing a backyard space. And then that I can see that how that would allow for just a larger green space in general for everyone, and also more sort of maybe more lit area. I can understand that as we take what was a single family lot and try and fit 3 to 4 to 6 homes on it, that there's quite a bit of juggling and Tetris that we're playing. So I think I have an interest in increasing that community element and decreasing the sort of complexity for folks to make this Tetris puzzle happen. So I'm happy to waive the private outdoor space requirement, not to say that we don't want green space, but I'm very happy to have that be a communal shared space. And then again, as I think Councillor Dewey said, like the market will, let the market settle that one. I don't think that's necessarily something from my perspective that we have to impose. Along with the, I think the setback and parking and height discussions are interesting ones. I'll just leave the height one for now. I think the setback and parking one, I can see that there's a definitely a delta between what the province is suggesting and what we're recommending is going forward for the setbacks. And I think it can be the 3 meters I can see can be quite significant for development. And I know that if we are also increasing parking, having an increased parking requirement, increased setback requirement, and decrease maximum height allowed, that it can just allow for like a more difficult Tetris puzzle. So I'm happy to take a more conservative approach in sort of ensuring that the neighborhoods sort of transfer well into this new paradigm. And I'm thinking about sort of particularly the west side of Maple Ridge as BRT comes in, right? And that there'll be more sort of, that's really where we want to focus development along the downtown core and around the low heat transit corridor area. So I'm happy to take maybe a conservative geographical approach as well, where we phase in parking that is more in line with what the province is suggesting, and setback requirements that is more in line with what the province is suggesting around the parts of the area where we do want to encourage this kind of density. And for places where it takes 4 hours to get from Powassan to back home, that's not necessarily a place where we do want to encourage that kind of density, right? So where the BRT is going to be servicing, and where we do expect when as the mayor continues to lobby for transit improvements in our community, we're likely to see more of the transit improvements come faster on the west side of Maple, which I think is a reasonable thing, especially if we're also asking the community to take in a recreation center that we focus more of that density, increased density on that west side of Maple Ridge, so the west side of Maple Ridge in the town center. So I'm happy to have more following the setback allowances of the province, more off the get-go, and the parking requirements more off the get-go for this side of the community. I think that makes sense given where we want to go with density in our community and where we see our community going, focusing density on one side of the city and not on the other side of the city. Yeah, and I think that should allow for it. I think in terms, and I just want to pick out what Councilor Sheila was saying, how we measure this sort of the success of this policy. I'm really interested when it comes back, like Councilor Claire was saying, like to look at the numbers of housing starts and the number of development applications that have come in. I think that would give us a good understanding of, as you said, this government that we're all learning together. And I know that we're different jurisdictions saying, okay, well, you're putting these changes, but it's not really going to affect the number of housing starts given where the economy is, given like the array of other requirements that these guys have put in. This may not actually increase the number of housing starts. And at the end of the day, what we want is the increased number of housing starts. So I would love to see that number come back, and maybe like you can help me with this, maybe it's the number of development applications or whatever it is along the lines to the number of housing starts. That would be a useful thing for me. And then sort of to wrap it up in terms of timing, I did as well see a lot of the when BRT is complete. I think, when a housing, someone thinking about development now, that home is not gonna be complete until, anywhere from 2 to 5 years from now, which is when by that point, hopefully, particularly the tail end, we will have BRT complete. So I'm not necessarily inclined to wait until BRT is complete before we then consider changes, because like you said, like everything is delayed, not delayed, but it just takes time for it to catch on the policy. So given that we know that BRT is coming, we are banking on BRT coming into our community, it's like, let's build as if BRT is here. Because by the time the housing forms are built, BRT will be here. So I'm happy to have, again, on the west side, let's on the west side where we want density, allow for that kind of setback, allow for parking requirements again to incentivize this where this is. And for the other sides of the community, where we don't necessarily want the density, let's stick with more conservative and very slower approach. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Before we go to round two, I'll just throw my comments in here. I guess the parking, it can be a challenge. I'm curious to know, earlier this year or late last year, we were working on a parking bylaw. How does that impact what you presented today, or does it impact, or is it all out the window now?
So the parking bylaw that you saw at the end of last year didn't propose a reduction in parking spaces for these types of housing forms. It was very much status quo from what we saw in our current parking bylaw, namely the two required spaces per housing type. The other part, like the draft parking bylaw was really focused on your apartment style construction, so it doesn't touch that, it doesn't throw anything out the window. That parking bylaw will come back before you soon and will incorporate the small scale multi-unit housing requirements. When we bring the bylaw forward in June, you will see an amendment to the existing parking bylaw. I guess that's just one of the comments to make, because I have to amend the one in effect. But this piece of work does not significantly change the conversations that we were having about parking ratios for apartments and purpose-built rental, and that piece of work is still ongoing.
So what was presented is, that's the province saying this is what you need to do for that. Do we have any say in the matter?
The parking so the 400, we have no say.
We have no say.
Outside of the province actually has a preference for a rate between 400 and 800, and then 800 and above. Based on how our community is shaped, it's kind of a wash. Like 800 takes you to the end of our urban area boundary anyway, so we're not necessarily looking at that at this exact moment. So they have some preferences, some strongly worded preferences on what they would like to see from 400 out. We are not in alignment at the moment with what they would like to see
Yeah,
on parking.
I would agree with that, because when we're talking about 400 meters to transit, is that 400 meters from a bus stop? I am concerned, because we've heard from many people as we were going through the original bylaw. There's folks that don't want any parking, because we know a parking stall can cost $50,000 each, right? So my concern is this going to be an unintended consequence of what the province is telling us to do?
So one of the elements that this is a little bit of a side conversation, but I would just identify that a lot of those purple lots are within your Logie Transit Corridor area. So while under this piece of legislation, the province is saying, no, like, yes, you're allowed 6 units, and no, we're not going to ask you to require parking, the future of the area plan isn't for small scale multi-unit housing within this corridor. So it's allowed, or it will be allowed very shortly, but ultimately with the adoption and endorsement of that area plan, that's the future that we are envisioning for this corridor. So it's a separate conversation. At that point, we're looking at mixed use, we're looking at apartments, we're looking at larger townhouse developments, all of which are not captured under the legislation today. So you will still be able to shape what this community looks like, just under a slightly different tool.
Okay, thank you very much. Round two, Councillor Dewitt, followed by Councillor Carrera, followed by Councillor Schiller.
Thank you. So just speaking to the public amenity space, like for each unit. I would cautious us on looking at it as a entire piece for all three. And this is why, who's gonna agree to look after it? It's not like a strata where they pay fees to look after that. And if I'm very fussy about how my yard is kept versus the two neighbors beside me, that would be a challenge. If they agree, once they're all neighbors, that's a different story, but for us to say it should be an amenity space for all three, I would cautious us, because it's not like they can decide who's gonna look after it. And the other piece is, if people have animals, they want to be able to have a little fence for their dog or whatever. So I agree with just keeping it the way it is, and we will also want these units to be livable. So it's the reason people would choose this over a townhouse or an apartment building is because it's not strata. It's still single family, somewhat more affordable, and I say somewhat because there really isn't anything that's affordable nowadays for young families. But it is a more affordable choice than a larger lot, single family home that allows them to have suites so they can coexist in one building. So that's my only cautions about making it an amenity space for the entire property versus individuals. I could just see the disagreements and causing neighborhood conflict.
Interesting point. Thank you. Moving on to Councillor Carrera.
Thanks. Just one question on that piece, is a balcony considered private outdoor space?
For townhouses today, yes, we haven't written the requirement yet, so certainly open to taking feedback on that.
So like rooftop.
Rooftops could be an option.
No, it's grass area, like those are all considered.
Where I try to come from is it's either ground or like it needs to be usable.
Mhm.
So like a Juliet balcony, no, if it's ground floor and you can let like a dog run out or whatever, or if it is like a decently sized flat rooftop. Yes, right, like there's a little bit of a reasonable test to it. In our townhouse, we do require the private and the communal right to kind of speak to both of those needs. And I'm sure we can write in a little bit of flexibility so that as long as it's a reasonable private outdoor space, we'll try the flexibility.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
if it
you
doesn't
see a
work-
lot of rooftop, right? I think that's exactly right. So I was just curious. This is more for mayor and CEO around communications. How do we communicate out to the community? What the province is making us do and what our ability and decision-making for our community. I've seen other communities do some really amazing communications pieces, and I hope that we can take a look at that and make sure that we are communicating with the folks in our community around what is happening and what that could look like and what that would mean for their community and what the province is responsible for and what we are responsible for. Some of the other legislation, especially around public hearing, local governments getting a lot of the hit on removing public hearing, and we had nothing to do with that. So the question that Councillor Tan brought up around, and I am actually not opposed to doing staged even with our setbacks and things like that, like, because we're doing it with parking, you see it already with the transit and the TOA stuff. I'm not opposed to having, as we get further out, a more, conservative approach on our setbacks and everything, so that we can do more because of course we want to focus that development along the low-heat transit corridor. But so this is my question, because you referenced east to west, like you referenced, let's focus on the west versus the east. But what I'm wondering is if we stay in tune with the provincial government and we stay like north-south with which one makes more sense, right? Like, do you know what
Yeah.
do you know where I'm going? Is it, instead of doing it this way staged, is it better to do our stage this way? So it's in line with where that be, and again, the BRT is going to Langley, like it's not taking you down the low heat into Poco, it's here to Langley to hopefully hook up with the SkyTrain one day. So I agree with the comments around BRT, it's awesome and we need to have it and it will help build transit, but anyhow, just
on that front, bearing in mind the multiple phases, right? So this is to meet the June 30th deadline. We have an area plan underway along this corridor. Once that comes before council and is endorsed and adopted, that gives us a little bit more certainty with the land uses that we're working with. And then that's when we kind of have that reduced parking requirement. It's a lot easier to be consistent and across the board to begin with, and then shift it into geographical areas. Because to your point, it is a conversation we're having about north-south and how we facilitate the development into our growth corridors as opposed to unintentionally encouraging greenfield where we don't necessarily have the infrastructure. That element will likely be iterative and ongoing. This is just that short-term starting point. And those are the conversations that we will have both with council as well as the community as the various pieces go forward.
Okay, so you're saying let's take a uniform approach to start with, and then, I mean, it's coming back to us in a year anyhow.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
it's not that long of a time. We'll start to have feedback quite quickly. The area plan will be back for you in not too long a time either. So we can certainly have those conversations. And just briefly on the communication, we were hoping to have this conversation with council, and then we do have communications ready to go out to the community.
Thank you,
So
I appreciate
it's
that.
coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think the challenge is to first, really for us to understand what the changes are and how they're going to impact us.
Hey, I wasn't saying it had to happen already, I was just saying,
Yeah.
have we thought about a communication plan
Yeah.
to the community? So happy, very happy to hear that you guys are ready to go. Thank you.
Councillor Schiller.
Thank you, Mayor Remy. Just briefly, I just wanted to say that, what Councillor Chen was proposing seems very logical. That we need to accommodate growth. Let's allow places for it where it makes the most sense, and where it's gonna best fit in, how the nuts and bolts of how we get there and the timing. That's fine, but I think that does, make a lot of sense. The green space requirement is an interesting one, to think about. Because when it was first raised, I was actually imagining like a multi-generational situation where that particular group would much rather have a shared green space. But it just goes to show there's lots of different situations out there. Very good point about the maintenance. And so again, we've got a lot of change going on. We don't have to change everything, but I do just sense that, to support more housing and being built, I think in some ways we are gonna have to be a little bit less prescriptive and just sort of let the market decide and let consumers find products that meet their own needs. But I think we'll get there as we go. I would just say that certainly for me, I need the green space to remain green space, whether it's shared or private. That's just very key in meeting some of our other goals. Thank you.
Councillor Chen.
Yeah, thanks for that. That makes a lot of sense to me, Councilor Schiller, about the pieces you identified. I think I'm really glad and cute that we have a communications plan in place. I think that will really help the community understand what's rolling out and how it's gonna affect them. And I can appreciate this, one thing have simplicity in the communications plan as well. And I think for me, simplicity in communications means having sort of fewer, to the degree that we can, some fewer changes. So I would be heartened to see sort of a more in line with the province's suggestions for parking and setback in the area that we spoke about, this our core area, sooner in the process rather than 1 year later. So I would love to see that right off the bat, just for ease of communication, so that folks understand what's going on. And then wider areas can figure it out themselves. And just to that point again, I guess where do we find this spot in being not that prescriptive, so that developers don't have all these yet another checkboxes to go through. And to some degree, letting the market decide, whether it's about whether private green space now becomes a marketable feature or not, we don't leave it to them. I sort of want to concern ourselves and our staff too much with things that ultimately is really up to the market. So that's where I'm at with that. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. Not seeing any other comments or questions.
I'll move the recommendation.
Can I get someone to move the recommendation?
She moved it, I'll second it.
Well, you guys are ahead of me. Wow. Great, thanks.
Then we're helping you. We're helping.
Moved and seconded. Any further comments? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Motion is carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Can I get a motion to go to close? Moved by Councilor Carrera, seconded by Councilor Can. All those in favor? Motion carried.